Hi, Mark.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Mark Oppenheimer. You've been on before, at that point, as author of a book about a sex-crazed Zen monk, as I recall. Was it the Zen predator of the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side?
East Side. He was pretty Tony. Yeah, he was pretty uptown, upscale.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was actually that he apparently became the basis for a character in a novel. The writer Jessica Gross has a new novel out with a yoga predator, not a Zen Buddhist predator. But she told me that I helped inspire that. So Edo Shimano will live on in literature, if not in life.
But you will not get any royalties out of this.
That's okay.
If this is
I've done my part for the cause.
If this is optioned by Hollywood and you don't get any money, you will not be resentful.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Good. Now, you're also known, at least until recently, as the beliefs columnist, or one of two beliefs columnists for the New York Times. And then you decided a few months ago to step down after 6 years of faithful service. And so I wanted to do kind of an exit interview with you and talk to you about what you've learned about beliefs, spirituality, religion, and so on in America. I should say you did your own exit interview. Which is a time saver for those of us who want to give you an exit interview. It's on your blog, and we'll link to it.
Thanks.
But why don't we start off by asking why you decided to leave?
Really, it just felt like time. My enthusiasm wasn't there every month when it rolled around. I've been cut back from bi-weekly to monthly, which should have made things easier because it was fewer good ideas I had to come up with every year. But in reality, I was just petering out. I had done this pretty regularly really quite regularly for 6.5 years. And I was beginning to resent the commitment when it came around. I was beginning to feel that it put the brake on other projects that I had going. And, I think some of it was a midlife thing. I quit right around the time I turned 42, which felt like, what was I going to do? Keep writing this column forever?
You could buy a sports car. That's how some men handle middle age.
Or, maybe if it were a more lucrative column, I could have taken the proceeds. The calculus was, what are the reasons that one writes? One writes either for artistic fulfillment, or because you have arguments to make to change the world, or for money, or for prestige and adulation. And, the money was not life-changing money. I didn't have a strong polemical case I wanted to keep making to the world, which is something that I think some op-ed columnists do. They feel they have to keep their particular brand of politics on a particular page, lest it disappear.
And you had grown tired of the adulation.
I'd grown tired of the adulation. The adulation was really just wearisome, just wore me down more than anything.
You couldn't go to a shopping mall without
all the autographs that I had to stop for. And so I couldn't see the reason to keep doing it if it wasn't as much fun as it used to be. And it wasn't. That was all.
Now, when the Times cut you back to once a month, it wasn't personal. They were cutting the column back from every week to every 2 weeks, and there were two columnists, right? So
No. They were cutting. We were already every 2 weeks. We alternated, Sam Friedman and I, and we each were cut back to once a month. So it was Friedman column, no column, Oppenheimer column, no column.
So
but it was not personal. We survived longer, or I survived longer than the bridge column and the chess column, which were killed altogether.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, like what, if anything, that says about religion in America. Of course, it may say something about print newspapers in America, because this was a column that was appearing in the physical newspaper, right? That's why space was scarce. Otherwise, if it was just online, they wouldn't have said, we're cutting it back. They would have said, we're paying you less, right? Right. So what?
This national desk doesn't do really, I think with some exceptions, they don't do web-only stuff. I think they ought to, but they say they don't have the editorial resources to edit that much more stuff. So whereas there are some sections that have certain things that appear only online, the national desk, which I wrote for, if they can't get it into the print version of the paper, they don't do it. So that kind of foreclosed that option.
Okay. Well, does their cutting back say anything about the status of religion in America?
I don't think so. Someone pointed out to me that right around the time that I quit my column, the Atlantic magazine which you know, advertised for an associate editor for religion, and Vox, which is an online news site, advertised for a religion writer. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you'd think during this presidential season, especially, religion matters more than ever. I think it was that the freelance, when you go for cuts in order to preserve jobs for your full-timers, you go after the freelance budget, which I was on, and I think that's right. I want them to preserve jobs for full-timers. But again, I still had a monthly column.
Right. So that wasn't, it wasn't on a per-hour basis. They weren't cutting you back. So what have you learned? 6 years is a fair amount of time to observe religion and spirituality in America. Give us a take-home lesson.
I don't think anything that others haven't said, but among some of the lessons, right? I believe less than ever that people really mean what they say religiously, and I'll tell you what I mean by that.
You believe it less than ever, or you think they mean it less than they used to mean it?
No, the former. In other words, I am confirmed in my belief. More than ever, I believe what I already believed, which was that most people say one thing, but deep in their bones mean another, right? And this goes back to, this is something that has made sense to me about religion since reading Wittgenstein in graduate school, which was, he said that when people say, I believe in God, they're not making the same kind of claim as when they say, look, there's a bird in the sky or a plane in the sky. They're making a different kind of claim. It's not, even if they think they're making a fact-based claim, they're not in the same way. They're saying something dispositional. They're saying something about their attitude toward the world, how they greet the world, but they're not really making a kind of fact-based claim. So, for example, if all the people who say that they believe in a real hell, in a fiery hell, for sinners, really believed that, they would sin less, right? I mean, you just wouldn't have as many devout Christians pretty blithely, having one affair and then the next affair and then the next affair. They would take more. It's not that they wouldn't sin, because built into the theology is the idea that we all, can't help but sin. But you just can't observe religious people, or any people really, but we're speaking of religious people who are no worse or better than anyone else. You just can't observe religious people for very long without concluding that on some level they think that the theology is somewhat metaphorical, or is a kind of useful guide for living, but not exactly true. Because if you actually thought that hell awaited you, you would behave differently. Let me give another example. I'm struck by the people who say they're devoutly religious and that only their particular brand of religiosity gets you into the world to come, into the afterlife, who are married to people who are not of that faith, right? So you take someone like Maggie Gallagher, the former head of founder of the National Organization for Marriage, real traditional marriage, anti-gay marriage activist, right? Now, she's a religious Catholic, right? Religious Catholics have a particular theology about who gets to heaven and who doesn't. It's not quite as brutal as a lot of evangelical theologies. There's room for purgatory. There's, there are people who are kind of squidgy around the edges about the mystical question of whom God might choose to save. But basically, if you want to go to heaven, partake in the sacraments, right? She's married to a guy who's, ancestrally Indian. I think he's like a lapsed Hindu or something. If I'm not mistaken, Robert George, the very conservative Catholic Princeton theologian, I think he's married to a Jewish woman.
I can ask. I'm going to have a conversation with him on this platform in a couple of weeks.
And I could be getting some specifics wrong, but I think that's right. I mean, but there's a number of cases where you have to say, now, if on some level you really believe that the person you love who puts her head on the pillow or his head on the pillow next to you every night is going to hell, and you're certain of that theology, this relationship would not work. You would have too much anxiety too much of the time. This marriage would not. So I just think that a lot of people are much less committed to the truth propositions of their religions than they say they are, which means they do them for the other reasons that we know people do religion, because it structures their lives, because it gives them meaningful rituals, because it gives them good communal life, and so forth.
I don't know.
Buying it.
What? Well, I think first of all, I mean, as for the, whether the God, what the God exists claim means, I mean, surely you would agree that 500 years ago the world was full of people who really literally believed it in the way that a bird exists, and that maybe there were fewer 50 years ago, but some probably. I mean, I'd say that. As for hell, I think, you never know how people would be behaving if they didn't believe in hell. Might be even worse. And finally, I'd say, I mean, my upbringing was very different from yours. I was brought up by Southern Baptist parents who, I believe, certainly my mother, probably my father, believed these things pretty literally. I think she believed in heaven and hell, and she seemed to me like a very good person, and probably partly as a result of a belief in the incentive structure of the afterlife. And the final thing I'd say is I think people, it's certainly true that people are very good at adjusting their religious beliefs to accommodate their lifestyle. I mean, look, there are a few people who are ultimately more cynical than I am about human nature and in general.
Right.
People are very good at reorienting their worldview to render it compatible with their behavior. But I do think they at least go through that motion. So in other words, these people, if you ask these people, but wait, you're married to a Jew, they're not going to go to heaven, right? They would probably have thought about it and have some amendment, right?
No question, but first of all, these are often very smart people, and their amendments or their explanations are often pretty weak. But I would go back to what you said about the incentive structure, right? What's interesting is how little that incentive structure seems to work, right? So when we look at differences in behavior between people who profess these really serious beliefs, and again, lots of people who are religious in all sorts of ways are not theological believers or fideists in the way we're talking about, right? There's all sorts of liberal Protestants and Reformed Jews and Eastern spirituality people who aren't captured by this discussion, right? But what's interesting is among the people who are, the kind of people who are from communities like the one you grew up in, what's interesting is that when they study their behavior, it's so darn similar to the behavior of people who are atheists or who just never think about it. Mm-hmm. So that also just strikes me as weird, right? Like, how could it not, shouldn't there be 30% less adultery, or just to pick an easy low-hanging fruit one, right? Maybe not the most meaningful one. Shouldn't there be like 30% less adultery in really, really religious communities? And the fact that there's not, or that divorce has completely lost its stigma, and the stigma disappeared so quickly in the 70s in religious Christian communities. Randy Ballmer argues because they wanted to reconcile their preference of Ronald Reagan, a divorced man, for president. They wanted to dissipate that cognitive dissonance. But so what do you make of that? The sort of absence of different behavior.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd say there are kind of two separate questions, too. There's, do they, in their conscious mind, believe in hell, A, and B, if so, has that belief significantly altered their behavior? It's possible if the answer to one is yes and the answer to the other is no as well. Yeah. But, I mean...
Let me say, that's not the most, to go back to your question, that's one thing that occurs to me sometimes is that I'm skeptical of how much people believe the stuff they say they believe, even though they may think they believe it. That's another possibility, right?
Well, okay, now we're getting into what belief means. I mean, if you think you believe something, I think you kind of do, but...
I agree, but I think here's the other thing, I think, which I've long believed, and my reporting on it did nothing to dissuade me of this, which is that people's belief changes and it waxes and wanes. I once had this argument over email, I think, with Rod Dreher, where I said, well, I just don't believe that they're believers all the time. There are some people who are always believers and some people are always atheists, but I think most people are in a state of flux about their metaphysics of the world. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is but that's not an okay thing to admit in most communities, including communities of belief. Mm-hmm. You can't go to church and say, I don't really feel like there's a God today, but next week maybe it'll be back.
Yeah. It's interesting, you mentioned Wittgenstein, who had this, I gather, I'm not a Wittgenstein scholar, had this belief about that the meaning of I believe in God is actually more pragmatic and less literal in some sense. He himself, I think, was quite religious, right? He was, I think he was a Christian, although a partial Jewish
Oh,
ancestry.
he was. I think he was. I once read the greatest biography I've ever read is the Wright Mark biography of Wittgenstein. My recollection is that he was one of those ancestrally fully Jewish Germans whose parents had converted.
Okay.
I don't think that he was ever a Christian believer. So,
but he considered himself, in some pretty deep sense, religious. I think.
My recollection is that he was kind of a mystic, but. You know,
yeah.
I forget. The truth is I forget.
At one point, he defined religion as like the state of feeling ultimately safe or completely safe or something, which is an interesting thing to play around with, because there is the theistic version of that, God will take care of me, and then there is the Buddhist version of that, which is that I have divorced my own well-being from the objective circumstances of my life that I'm ultimately safe. And who knows where he was, I guess, on that spectrum.
Yeah, and I mean, but he also just, it was a question of what you thought language did, right? And so, I mean, he thought that religious people were in a particular discourse, a particular language game. Now, you're right that at one point in time, in pre-modern times, for a lot of people, that aligned pretty closely with the other kinds of propositional truths that they were stating all the time, right? That they had this, you know, Charles Taylor talks about that sort of enchanted world, that's what they were walking around in a way that even believers today are not. So that's true. I mean, I'm talking about contemporary American religiosity. Look, I think most people, and again, I like most people. I'm kind of a booster of humans. I'm an optimist. I have very little tragic sense. Very little gets me down. I don't hold grudges. Like I'm sort of, you know, oppressively cheery by disposition and temperament. So I don't say this with any sort of hatred toward my fellow human. And in fact, I'm describing myself when I say that for most Americans, their religion is the marketplace and sports and, you know, shopping and comfort. It's so much more so than 500 years ago, right, when human life was oppressive and short. And so I think it was much easier to abstract up into and to want to live in the realm of these propositional truths about an afterlife. But why would you be abstemious and self-denying for, you know, so as not to sin when you could go be gluttonous and have fast food and then have sex? And that's just a much harder thing to do today. And so, which is why you end up with the dominant religion for so many people being a kind of prosperity gospel where everything comes into alignment, where you can have Jesus and your McMansion. So that's where a lot of people are. I mean, a lot of people don't even have a kind of prophetic critique of that fusion, of that syncretism between kind of suburban luxury and Christianity or Judaism, for that matter, or Islam. You know, America is very seductive that way.
In fact, you know, this Gulen guy who's gotten so much attention because Turkey wants to extradite him. As I understand Gulanism, there's a little bit of prosperity gospel there. He said to Turks, you can be prosperous and successful and be a good Muslim.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. And it's not for nothing that, like, he went, I don't know why he chose rural Pennsylvania, but it's not for nothing, right? And that, of course, is very threatening to Islamists who, you know, for whom kind of self-abnegation and denial and martyrdom is the regnant philosophy. It's kind of the opposite.
Yeah. Although I don't think that's Erdogan's chief concern at the moment. I think it's more a political issue right now. But so let's talk about, you know, spiritual but not religious. Big phrase. While you're starting to write the beliefs column. But what's your take on what that means? Are there a ton of people who describe themselves that way, for starters?
The surveys show, I did a column on this about a year and a half ago, and the surveys show that that's a growing category of people. But, you know, the surveys show that because they often offer it as an option, right? So you can say that you're, you know, a Christian or an atheist or this or that, or you can check spiritual but not religious. And for a lot of people, that speaks to something they have felt about themselves, which is they're not regular churchgoers, synagogue goers, whatever, but they feel some, you know, sense of the ineffable, or, you know, the kind of the ground of being underlying it all, the eternal. And so spiritual but not religious, or as the scholars now say, SBNRs, fits the bill. I should say, and actually now's a great time to come clean about this, though anyone who's read my writing won't be surprised, right? That I just have a sort of icky prejudice against it. I'm sure this has come through in my writing, which is I just have known too many people who were the people who were using that phrase 10 years ago, the real pioneers of that mode of thinking, were often such sort of credulous, woo-woo followers of anything.
Well, that's a question, because you earlier defined spiritual but not religious in more sophisticated terms, right? They have a very abstract theology, the ground of being, whatever. Now you're talking about woo, and this has been my question about spiritual but not religious. What do people mean by the spiritual part? And I have found that they could mean either of those. The one I'm interested in personally is more the first one you mentioned, which is ideally an intellectually defensible sense of spirituality, and not the belief that what is the something about if you water molecules will arrange themselves in the word love if you think of or something, if you not the woo stuff. What have you found that people are all across the spectrum when they say I'm spiritual but not religious?
Look, I mean, for some people, what it means is that they're on a journey where they're investigating a lot of different paths, and they haven't landed on one. But what they identify as is that they're seekers and questers. By the way, before proceeding, we should insert the idea that there are enormous snobberies here, so that the discussion often, especially when I'm leading it, alas, takes the form of, are these people serious about some sort of practice? In other words, we'll take you seriously as a spiritual person, as opposed to thinking of you as one of those hippy-dippy spiritual people, if you have a lot of discipline and if you're after a practice that involves commitment and sacrifice and lots of hours of either sitting or reading or chanting, but something. Mm-hmm. And then if you are treating it as a kind of lifestyle accoutrement that you fit in between Pilates and binge-watching HBO, but never really get deep into, that somehow that's superficial. Now that may be a totally indefensible snobbery, but that's kind of the assumption from which all of this proceeds. And so what I think then happens is I tend to sort these people into various categories based on are they serially dipping into stuff in a really intense, curious, intellectually rigorous way, or are they just kind of flitting about and calling themselves this and that, and changing their Facebook status from Buddhist to spiritual not religious to Zoroastrian to whatever. So I can't divorce it from just those kind of judgments.
Right. And you secretly make those judgments. In other words, okay, this really is spiritual. What this person's doing, this really isn't.
Right. There's something like if spiritual is the good stuff, is they're after the same. They're trying to answer the same sorts of tough questions, mm-hmm. and unknot some of the same problems that religious people are, or that philosophers are, mm-hmm. Or that just caretakers, end-of-life caretakers are, right? People who are confronted with these big questions on a regular basis and don't flinch, right? Mm-hmm. If that's spiritual, that's one way of doing it without organized religion, there's something else, which is maybe just, I don't even know what the word for it would be, but it's the Oprah stuff. When in the last few years of her show, she was having on every quack, everyone who'd written a flimsy self-help book, and there was no fine line between those people who had some pretty good life practices and psychics, homeopaths, alternative medicine quacks, anyone who was giving you some sort of sense of meaning that wasn't scientific. Mm-hmm. You answered a problem that science couldn't offer with something else, no matter how obviously stupid, counted. And I don't know what you call that kind of lower level stuff.
So is it important to you, in order to be spiritual, does a worldview have to have a moral dimension? Does it have to, in principle, make you behave better toward other human beings, or at least have that dimension of concern and inquiry?
I think, right. So I think, and by the way, this is interesting, you could talk a little bit about Buddhism here, because one of the critiques of some strains of Buddhism is that they don't have an ethics, right? That they have a practice but no ethics. But yeah, I think if I'm to be honest with myself, one of the things I'm looking for is that there's a moral dimension, that there's some aspect of what can we at least strive for in terms of how to treat others, that there's a kind of moral absolutism, that in the universe there exists something, whether we have access to it or not, that's not relativistic about what the good is. And again, if I'm being honest, it can't run totally contrary to science. That is to say, if it's a way to reject hard scientific truths or just accepted scientific truths, right? If it's a way, if your end times theology allows you to ignore climate change, well, that's a huge problem. You better fix your theology. And if your alternative spirituality keeps you from vaccinating your children, then you probably need a new spirituality. Mm-hmm. So, it can't run contrary to basic common sense is another thing.
Yeah. Buddhism's interesting because, on the one hand, Buddhism as a true religious tradition is suffused with explicit ethical guidance. It's then, when as it's come west and has become a lot of different things, including a strictly secular version, there have been people who want to divorce it from any ethics. At the same time, there's a premise in a lot of kind of Buddhist thought that even if you focus on the self-help part, it will tend to make you a better person. In other words, if you set out to end your suffering and do the things that are prescribed, it will make you a better person. I think that's more often true than not. And in fact, I think the most secular version is just mindfulness-based stress reduction. Well, if you're less stressed out, you'll probably be nicer to people at the grocery store. That's actually true. But the culminating irony is that at the very end of the path of Buddhism, when you achieve true enlightenment, there are real questions about whether it becomes a complete moral relativism. And that's a discussion for another day, but that's my take on Buddhism.
And I always want to be mindful, so to speak, of that aspect of Buddhist practice, which is that, right, a lot of people enter in this really beneficial way of stress reduction or taking time for morning sits or whatever that can't help, they can't be bad things, right? And of course, the teachings are suffused with ethics, even if some strands of it have minimized those. I'm going back to the question of whether people, I'm always skeptical of claims of any school of thought that say will make you act better. It just doesn't seem that we've ever found one of those. And, it's interesting. I'm really confronted with some of these theological questions when I go to places where people seem genuinely nicer. Mm-hmm. So, like, a trip to Canada can be or Minnesota, to visit my brother in St. Paul, can be very anthropologically disorienting for me. Because I feel like there's probably, I tend to believe there's a pretty evenly distributed amount of anger and immaturity and solipsism to go around in the human race. And maybe they're just all hiding it well. But you do go to some places where whatever the cultural practices are, they seem to have made for a better civilization. You'll see, everyone who comes back from Finland or Norway says this about, or Denmark says this about these places. And then you can argue, well, are there are there government policies that have made people more secure and thus less stressed and thus better able to allow their better angels to flourish? And I don't know. But in America, I tend to see sort of the same pathologies infecting every group, religious or not. So it's disorienting to go to places where that doesn't seem to be as true.
I do think that with meditation, the more I meditate, the better person I am. It seems a pretty straightforward correlation with me, and I don't always succeed in meditating enough to be a very good person. But in my own life, I think I've observed the correlation. It's not guaranteed, and in fact, you can use meditation to sharpen your mental powers in ways that help you better exploit people, as you well know from having written The Zen Predator of the Upper East Side.
That might be the case for you, but then, of course, the question for it as a practice would have to take in a large sample size and say, for every Bob Wright, is there someone who made worse? In other words, the sample size might not be an N of 1. That might not be the meaningful question, right? The question might be, what if you took an N of 10,000? Right. How does it wash over a population? There's no logical reason that it would have to even out everywhere. It might be that the population, that there are a lot more Bob Wrights who are made better by it, but that's the question to ask.
Mm-hmm. But we agree that there should be more Bob Wrights in the world.
Unquestionably. And they should be in that nice cabin you appear to be in, which must be somewhere, it looks like you have nautical equipment behind you on the wall.
It's at a secure, undisclosed location, somewhere very near the Atlantic Ocean. So what's an example of something that's on the borderline, well, maybe beyond the borderline, of spiritual, not spiritual? You wrote about CrossFit, and I think you concluded that CrossFit, sorry, neither religious nor spiritual. Is that your view of CrossFit?
I mean, I tried not to let on that in the column, and one reason I think I had to stop writing the column was because I was finding it harder and harder to quash my own point of view. Yeah, I mean, my view of that, so, right, one of the questions that I think we sort of agreed is there an ethics toward how to treat other people? And what was so interesting about CrossFit, which is a kind of exercise regimen that is franchised, right? There are these gyms across the country. I heard a good joke recently. Someone said, how do you know if your friend is polyamorous or into CrossFit?
I don't know.
She'll tell you. You know, CrossFit, like poly people and CrossFitters are always, they got to spread the gospel. They're always telling everyone. So, if we posit, as I think we did a few minutes ago, that ideally religion or spirituality should have some orientation toward how do you treat others, that one was a really interesting one for me, because on the one hand, I had this one interview with one woman who was very into her CrossFit gym, her CrossFit box, as they call it. And on the one hand, she said, well, this is my community of people whom I will do for. If somebody in this community has a baby or needs a moving truck or whatever, these are the people whom I put myself out for. And it's good to have a community of people that calls on you to do that. I really believe that. On the other hand, she said that I think she was newly married or about to get married, and she was planning to have kids soon. And she went to her CrossFit gym something like 2 or 3 hours a day. And I said, well, when you have an infant, do you think you'll go 2 or 3 hours a day? And she said, oh, of course I will. And I said, well, you know, as a father of young children, let me tell you that might be hard. And she said, no, I'll do it because I'll owe it to my child. My future daughter or son deserves to have a mother who cares for her, who models caring about your body in the way that I do, and who models healthy living that way. So I'll do whatever it takes to keep going to the gym 2 or 3 hours a day. And I thought, well, that's a really deep perversion of that, the self-justification there, right? That CrossFit is like, which is that CrossFit, I mean, if you want an argument for CrossFit as a cult, she just gave it to you, right? Which is that she's already laying the groundwork for the justification of checking out on her family obligations, not a little bit. Everyone should have their own life when they have kids and should have space for themselves and their spouse and their relationships and everything else, right? But she was already planning to do 2 or 3 hours a day of CrossFit when she had an infant because she owed it to the child. Now, again, that's an easy thing to say before you've had kids. You'll sing a different tune someday. But there is something about the sort of centrality of exercise as good in itself that I found really horrifying.
I'm also wondering how aware you can make the average 6-month-old that their mother is doing 3 hours a day of CrossFit.
At 5 a.m.
I think it's more of like
to be clear, the husband was a CrossFitter too, so
yeah.
Where's the nanny who comes from 5 to 8 so you can go CrossFit?
Well, are there any cases that you think are closer to qualifying as spiritual and or religious than CrossFit, but are not all the way over in the realm of traditional spirituality, religion?
Well, this isn't quite answering your question. You're looking for something that's even a little more liminal. But some of the explicitly secular humanist churches, right? So, I mean, ethical culture, which is a historically Jewish...
The granddaddy of all of these.
Yeah, Felix Adler's ethical culture, which has 20 locations throughout the country. The... what they call secular humanist Judaism, which is also has a few congregations and is slightly different. They keep more Jewish language. You know,
Sunday Assembly is a recent entry.
Sunday Assembly in England, Oasis in Kansas City and Houston.
Right.
You know, some Unitarian congregations. Unitarians can mean a lot of things. There are theistic and Christian Unitarians, but at a lot of Unitarian societies, what you get is spirituality and community, but without anything I think you would call religion. So that's interesting. I mean, these are people who a lot of these groups, Unitarians, Sunday Assembly, Oasis, I mean, these are people who often are explicitly atheist. They don't believe in any traditional idea of God, but they think that something about the human experience calls them into periodic assembly with others. Mm-hmm. So that's inspired by religion.
And there is a set of moral values, maybe explicit to varying degrees, more explicit maybe with Unitarians than with Sunday Assembly. But I spoke at a Sunday Assembly, and I certainly got the sense that these people share values, as congregations tend to do, even in the realm of politics. These seem to me to be kind of vaguely liberal people, and I guess Sunday Assembly also has at least a few actual tenets that are probably pretty broad, but there is that in all these things, right?
Right. I mean, if you wanted a somewhat more liminal experience, they don't ever call themselves spiritual, but if you wanted something that really functions like a religion, but would never call itself a religion, you could look at like the sci-fi community, which not only has, you know, strong communal ties, it's the primary affiliation for most of its or many of its members. It has these periodic conventions. You could be at a con every weekend. It has certainly sacred texts. But also they vary, a huge number of them share an outlook. It's often a sort of future-oriented, radical, progressive, sort of utopian futurism. You know, within that there are libertarian strains, there are socialist strains, there's feminist strains, there's queer strains, but there's deep kind of homologies within that community of people. And I always ask one of the questions I ask is if you want to know if something's a religion, ask yourself, are the members of this community also ever members of another religion? In other words, if you can do X, but also be like a deacon at your local, you know, Episcopal church, or, you know, or be a Presbyterian elder, I tend to then be skeptical that it's your religion because you're making time. I think religions tend to be totalizing.
But that's a pretty Western view, right? I mean, in the East, you can be a Taoist and a Buddhist. You may get married at a Buddhist temple, buried in a, you know, I mean, Western religions are famous for being exclusivist in ways that Eastern religions sometimes may be, but are less likely to be.
That's true. I guess, right. I guess I've had such a limited exposure to people who seem to genuinely be two or three things at once. I mean, I've known a lot of Eastern practitioners, but they're in America. Is it, I mean, Buddhism has so thoroughly collapsed in much of East Asia, as has Confucianism, for example. I mean, I'm curious if there are really a lot of people in East Asia now who are walking that path that you say, where they have two or three important side-by-side systems like that.
I think it's been particularly true in Japan. I think there are sometimes you might have a Shinto. You hear the same thing about Africa, by the way, where they will become Christian in some sense, and yet for certain things, maybe they'll be sick and they'll go next door to the healer who is of an indigenous tradition. Right.
No, and look, obviously, you see that with Latino Christianity and Pentecostalism, for example, in America, where it exists perfectly comfortably with, you know, with the botanicas and the native healing and or Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean tradition. So that's true. That's true. But I guess I'll just go back to saying that for a lot of people in the sci-fi community, they don't have other religions. That it is their religion. It's what they do on their weekends. It's the community of people they care about, and it's their value system. So that's one that I've been very interested in, and I've written about it primarily when it comes into contact with the humanist and atheist communities, with which there's enormous overlap.
One final point. I think it's the case that in the Roman Empire, there were, when Christianity was emerging, there were a number of non-exclusivist religions. There were cults, and people would pick and choose, and one distinguishing thing about Christianity was like my way or the highway. Right. And it seems to have worked. So I want to talk about your kind of current and future life, both your work at Tablet, the book you're working on, but before we go on, for the benefit of our students who have not taken a religious studies course recently, you want to tell us what you mean by the word liminal?
Oh, just on the margins between two spaces. You know, part one thing, part another.
A threshold. Okay. So about your present life. So you had been writing for Tablet for some time, I think, but now you should tell people what Tablet is in case they don't know.
Tablet is used to be a web-only Jewish magazine of arts, culture, letters. It's now has a print version that comes out quarterly, which is very beautiful and glossy, and I've written a little bit for. And now I've started a podcast with it called Unorthodox, which is a weekly podcast where a few of us discuss what we call the news of the Jews. And then we have two guests every week. Actually, you'll have to be one. One is our Jewish guest, one is our Gentile of the week. You would be a perfect Gentile of the week, Bob.
Why, thank you. No one's ever said that about me before, and I hope it doesn't go to my head, but...
Don't let it go to your head, but it's true. Actually, it can go to your head. So it's fun. It's a pretty, we don't spend a lot of time arguing Zionism. We spend a lot more time talking about Jewish practice, Jewish humor, making fun of Jews. We tell bad Holocaust jokes. We point out which Olympic stars are Jews. It's sort of eavesdropping on the Jewish barbershop, I think. So, but then a few summers ago, when our editor went on maternity leave, I was the acting editor for a few months of Tablet, and since then I've stayed on as what we call editor at large. Someone recently died who I think was the first ever editor at large, had invented that term at New York Magazine or something. I can't remember who it was. But so I edit pieces for them and do some writing. So I have that part-time work. And then I've just started doing a monthly column for the LA Times, not on religion, just on whatever I want, which is nice and fun. I'm going to write about my dog for one of my upcoming columns. My dog is dying, and I'm interested in the philosophical questions of how much money and attention and effort is okay to spend on a dying dog, which raises all sorts of questions.
That's a less somber take than one might imagine. I mean, as a dog owner, it's serious business. I mean, when I imagine my dog dying, it's like really hard.
Oh, well, this is I have 2 dogs, and the one that's ill, that has a tumor, and who may have many months left. It was the first dog I ever had, and I've had my dog longer than I've had my marriage or my children.
Yeah.
It's very painful to think about. So that'll be, I hope, one of my columns for the LA Times. So I'm doing it, and then I have an idea for a book. So we're doing a bunch of different things.
So tell us about the book, because I've heard you say a little about it, and and there's this. It's apparently going to address the Jew versus Jewish question. The terminological question, right? So
look, so here's the idea for the book, and which is, it's a non-scholarly book. I don't have good Hebrew or Yiddish. I'm not a Talmudist. I'm not a Torah scholar. It's a very, very layperson's book. It's going to address a fundamental problem, which is that Jews have absolutely no idea, by and large, what Judaism is or what they are supposed to be when they are told by the world and their parents that they're Jewish. We can understand this when we contrast Judaism with, say, Christianity. Now, it takes nothing away from Christianity to say that it's a fairly simple story, right? If you know that Jesus, was born, lived 33 years, did a lot of miracles, preached some beautiful truths, and then was crucified, and then 3 days later resurrected to sit at the hand, beside his Father in heaven, that's kind of what you need to know. And then if you know that Christmas is his birth and Jesus, Good Friday and Easter are his resurrection, death and resurrection, that's really 95% of what you need to grasp most sermons. Let's say you walk into any church, you want to connect with your Christianity more. Mm-hmm. You can plug right in. If you also happen to know then that Paul wrote a bunch of letters kind of adumbrating that philosophy and just flashing it out, you're then like 99% of the way there. I've just given it all in 40 seconds. Judaism is completely different. We have no 1 or 2 or 3 stories that capture. It's not like the Exodus is really the key story, or the destruction of the Second Temple, or the binding of Isaac. We have like 30 stories that all are kind of equally in play. We have 7 or 8 sort of co-equal holidays. So this is all before you even get to the question of whether it's a religion or a culture or a civilization or what. It's just like the basic story is really inaccessible unless you've had a pretty good amount of religious school. And so a lot of Jews have this thing where they don't know what it is they're supposed to believe or what the essential components of their thing are. And yet they're told that if they don't reproduce and make more Jews and stay faithful to Judaism, they've like completed the job of Hitler. So there's this enormous pressure to keep it going with zero knowledge or very little knowledge at the core of what it is they're supposed to keep going and why. Mm-hmm. So what I try to do, just to sum up, is give my explanation for what it is and why we feel it matters to us, even though we can't put it into words. And my explanation is that we've had the wrong metaphor for a long time. Jews have quarreled over whether it's a religion or a culture or, in Mordecai Kaplan's terms, a civilization. I think it's none. I think it's a family. Mm-hmm. And it's an extended kinship network, both literally, which we know, at least not just, well, Ashkenazi Jews are all descended from the same 350 people around the year 900, we've discovered. And even Sephardi Jews have very, very close relatives, right? We're all each other's cousins in much closer ways than I'm your cousin, Bob. But also metaphorically, that's what the religion has been doing, is saying we're an extended bunch of people who intermarry and keep up a family tradition. And, really to conclude, that's a sort of elemental truth. We can all understand that. We all understand on a base level why family matters. If you see Judaism as a family that we're trying to perpetuate, we don't have to question it farther than that, because everyone knows there's a kind of intrinsic good in family.
But one can convert. I mean, it's a very distinctive ethnic identity, and I'm wondering if you would say it's unique in the number of kind of dimensions of identity it has. So on the one hand, one can convert. So in that sense, you might think it's purely a matter of belief. On the other hand, if someone who's born Jewish entirely abandons all beliefs associated with Judaism, we still say they're Jewish. Or I think, as you're about to get around to recommending, we say they are a Jew rather than Jewish. We'll get to that, but...
Absolutely. It's all these things. I mean, there's been enormous amounts of conversion, which is why not all Jews look alike, which is why I'm phenotypically white, but a lot of Jews are not. And, there's been a lot of conversion. We're not all as closely related. There are, that metaphor, it's a flawed metaphor that I've just given you in many, many ways, and one can pick apart at it. I think that the theology is I treat it as sort of family lore, which may or may not be true. You can bracket the metaphysical truth or falsity of it and say it's our family lore, it's the stories that we tell at family reunions. I don't think there's such a thing as a bad Jew. I mean, a lot of Jews say, oh, I eat bacon, I'm a bad Jew. No, you're not a bad Jew. You're just a Jew who doesn't keep up certain family traditions as well, just as Bob Wright doesn't go to, South Padre Island anymore. He goes to the vineyard or whatever.
I've been to Padre. That's where I used to go when I was in high school, and we would want to misbehave. But that was an excellent call on your part. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, that essentially it's a family keeping certain things going, and you can drift away from. Some people choose to drift farther from it and feel that that's what's emotionally healthy for them is to be a little bit estranged, just as in nuclear families. And some people hew closely to it. But I think, but keep in mind how radically different that is from Christianity. And this is not totally. This is not judgmental here. This is just descriptive. Right. One of the central claims of Christianity is that it's not a family, that it would be a good thing if everyone were in it, that Earth is one family.
Neither Jew nor Greek, as Paul himself said.
And in fact, the more people you have in a congregation who are not related to each other, in a sense, some would argue, the healthier your relationship, your congregation is. What's more, there's no sense that you're supposed to reproduce anyone. Like, celibacy is an option in Christianity. In certain strains, it's a venerated one. Right? Whereas in Judaism, it's a non-option. In fact, you can't even say the prayers unless you live around 9 other Jews. Mm-hmm. You have to live in community. There's no hermit life, no hermeticism, no celibacy. Mm-hmm. The point is family. So that's kind of, but now look, I don't think that's a perfect description. It leaves a lot out, but I think for a lot of Jews, when I give them that metaphor, they're like, oh, right, that's how I feel about it.
Now, Christianity emphasizes family as metaphor and brother and sister and all that, but it's a metaphor.
Right, and I mean, it does it in exactly the opposite way, which is it says you can join the family through baptism, whereas in Judaism says, again, there is conversion, and there's a theology behind it, that there are Jewish souls in people who are not, who are not ancestrally Jewish, and that they recognize that. But basically the rule is if your mom ain't Jewish, or more liberal Jews would say if a parent ain't Jewish, you ain't. You have to go work to become it. So that's the opposite of Christianity.
But you can become it through conversion, or do you kind of have to marry a Jew for even the conversion to be considered legitimate?
There are lots of converts who are not married to Jews. And by the way, there's a very strong teaching that you don't ever make a convert feel self-conscious. You don't ask who's a convert. Mm-hmm. In my congregation, there are people who I'm sure are converts who I don't know are converts. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not a difference. It's not a disabled status. I think there's something back when there was a priestly caste. I think Kohanim aren't supposed to marry a convert. There's like 1 or 2 disabilities that no one knows about. But
okay. So explain the Jew-Jewish thing that you're going to get into the book. And by the way, are you disclosing the title of the book at this point?
Well, I think I'm going to call it How to Be a Jew, but
not How to Be Jewish.
I don't have a contract or an editor or even a finished manuscript. I've got about 3/4 of a manuscript. So, right. So one of the things that American Jews suffer with is and this goes a lot of the book is about self-loathing, which is very deep in Jewish communities. I mean, in all of us, me included.
You are not alone.
As with African Americans or queer people, it's almost inescapable. So one of the things that I talk about is how Christians are happy to say, I am a Christian. They're happy to own the noun. They don't say I'm a Christian person. They say, I'm a Christian. I mean, go on the Twitter feeds of evangelicals. It's always like, their bios is like, mother, Labrador Retriever owner, Cowboys fan, Christian.
And it's kind of a stronger claim of identity than the adjectival form.
And Jews never do that. People say, what's your religion? It's rare that you'll hear someone say, I'm a Jew. They'll say, I'm Jewish. Now, there's a reason for that, which is that in our culture, if you said about someone, oh, Oppenheimer, he's a Jew, or he's a real Jew, that's a bad thing. Whereas if you said he's a real Christian, that's a good thing. I mean, this anti-Semitism is baked very deeply into our language, right? He's a real Jew is never a good thing, right? So part of it is, I think, that if we see this partly in keeping with the metaphor I want to use, which is it's a family, then it's a noun. I'm an Oppenheimer, I'm a Jew. But also I think it's partly a sort of pushback against the internalized shame that we have.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to say, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say he's a real Jew in any sense, pejorative or otherwise. It's not a phrase I've heard, but I take your point that Christian is, well, both the noun and the adjectival form. I think there's a line in The Wizard of Oz where they say it's not very Christian of her or something. And you wouldn't say not very Jewish of you. I mean, well, maybe Jews would. I don't know, but
you might. I mean, you might say. I mean, right? It could get used in all sorts of ways within the community. But I will say, to your point, I have heard some people say. I've had someone say, and it was a Jewish person. It was a really self-loathing Jewish person. I've heard someone say to a relative of mine, "Don't be such a Jew," when she was, I don't know, asking to be reimbursed for having taken kids to the movies or whatever, and I mean, it lives.
So it was a Jew saying it?
It was a Jew saying it.
As a little bit of a joke, but drawing on what the popular understanding is thought to be.
And it was also a way of distancing herself from those other Jews. I mean, if you use it as an epithet, as a put down, then you're sort of saying, well, of course, I would never behave in that stereotypically Jewish fashion.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen the movie, I think it's Saved, about this evangelical private school or something?
No.
There's a funny moment. This can go in your book. It's an allusion to this taboo about using the word Jew, and one of the kids uses the word Jewish as a noun. They say
he's a Jewish.
He's a Jewish, and it's in the sense of a kind of a naive political correctness, but there is that sense implied that Jew as a noun is a pejorative.
Oh, and I start early in my book. One of the sections starts with an anecdote from when I was the Hartford Courant, and I was writing. This was when I was the religion reporter there in 2000, and I was writing about Joe Lieberman, and I referred to him. He was the vice presidential. He was Gore Lieberman, and I referred to him as a senator and a Jew or something. It was relevant that he was a Jew, and the copy editors changed it and said the Jewish senator from Connecticut, or who is Lieberman, who is Jewish. They wouldn't say who is a Jew. Yeah. And these were Gentile copy editors who said, we can't say that someone is a Jew. That's an insult. And I, of course, got up in high dudgeon and said, what do you mean it's an insult? But I knew what they meant. Mm-hmm. To a lot of readers, it's very jarring to see someone called a Jew, even if they are a Jew. Uh-huh. Just not be a problem with Christians. So
are you encouraging both Jews to call themselves Jews as opposed to Jewish, and Gentiles to call them Jews as opposed to Jewish, or...
I mean, the right well-meaning Gentiles. I mean, I'm encouraging the use of the noun. Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because if a lot of Gentiles started using it tomorrow, they get a lot of pushback from a lot of Jews whom it doesn't sit well with. So, but that's so it's kind of more notional than it is a programmatic assignment for all of us tomorrow. But I think we have to start thinking of it as a thick, personal noun-like identity.
Okay, so elaborate on why you want Jews to use it. That's to...
Because it's, I mean, in the simplest way, it shows more pride and ownership. It's a closer relationship to the word than if you use the adjective. So, it's meaningful for a black person to say, I'm an African American, mm-hmm. right? There's a reason. And now, look, is it so much better or different from saying I'm black or I'm African American? No, but you certainly wouldn't want them to be ashamed to say, I'm an African American. The fact that you could use it as a noun says something about your comfort level with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Final question. I want to get back to spiritual, but not religious.
Here's another difference, which is, if you were gay, right, there's a difference between saying, I'm a man who has sex with men, or I lead a homosexual lifestyle, and saying, I'm a gay person, or I'm queer is the adjective. But you see what I'm saying, mm-hmm. which is owning the identity is a
even queer is a different kind of ownership, because it's taking something that was strictly a pejorative and embracing it. So it's related to what you're recommending.
I do that too, by the way. I'm always talking about yids and heaps, but I don't recommend that for Christmas.
I avoid that myself. So finally, I want to get back to the spiritual but not religious question and connect it to the idea of Jewish identity. I think there are two people who have said to me, no, I'm not spiritual but not religious. I'm religious but not spiritual.
Yeah.
And both were Jewish, as we Gentiles say.
Right.
Not Jews, they were Jewish. But one actually was on this platform, Matt Iglesias.
Uh-huh.
And so what he meant, I think, was he does some of the observance, but he doesn't have the theistic beliefs, I assume. And it's funny, because I might have thought you could go spiritual but not religious with that. He wanted to go religious but not spiritual with it. Do you have a view on that?
Absolutely. Well, I don't say it a lot, but it probably describes me on most days. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about my theology, or I don't interrogate myself a lot on these questions. But I go to synagogue once or twice a week. Sometimes I go on a weekday as well. I take my kids every week. My wife goes with us often, but I'm the more observant person in the family. And I love religion. I mean, I love the communal aspects of it. I love the ritual. I love the way it puts me in mind of metaphysical things. Sometimes I feel like it has a mystical, component to it. It really is kind of can be numinous. But I don't question. It's clear to me that I like having religion in my life. I don't feel particularly spiritual. It's not a word I'd ever use for myself. I actually, by the way, think that Orthodox synagogues are filled with people like this. I mean, this is one of the great secrets of Judaism, which is because Judaism foregrounds practice and not belief, there are lots of people who are raised with the practice deep in their bones, who may have belief when they're young, but then they lapse in their belief, but keep the practice because the practice structures their lives and gives them community in ways that are meaningful. So I think that that's a very live option for Jews. By the way, I've talked, I have one friend who's a lapsed evangelical pastor who said to me, the evangelical world is filled with people like this too. They just can't admit it. In Judaism, you could have a sort of argument. You can have an argument in an Orthodox synagogue about whether God exists. And if you're wearing your yarmulke and you keep kosher and you're all there together, you're not a bad Jew. You're there. You're in community. You're buying in. It'd be pretty dangerous in a lot of Christian communities to raise atheism during coffee hour.
Yeah, you would not. I mean, this has long been thought to be true of some mainline Christian churches, and you're suggesting it's also true of evangelical churches. But you're right. I think that's where you draw the line. You would not be overt about atheism, because
it's somewhat chic among some rabbis to, or a lot of intellectually oriented religious Jews will they play with it because it's okay to. So. Yeah, I think I like that descriptor of religious, but not. I mean, I'm very drawn to what got me into writing about religion. To bring it all back, is like I'm really drawn to it as a sort of persistent human experience that will never go away, that can do enormous good or enormous ill. And in that regard, it strikes me as one of those human creations. Not God, who may be real or may not, but religion, organized religion, strikes me as one of those human creations, like the marketplace, like government, like the military, like science, that we have to understand, and which can be marvelous or deadly. Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting to me, much more so than a kind of like Thoreauvian walk and commune with nature, and I don't have a lot of that in me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much. People can find your work at Tablet, at the LA Times. They can just Google you and comb through the archives of the New York Times.
Awesome. We'll do it again.
Okay. Looking forward to it. Take care.
Bye-bye.